Hey guys, Captain Smash, Smash the Strength Lab, Ottawa, Ontario. Today's topic is all about fat storage and fat loss. So now we're gonna go into a little bit of how we store fat predominantly for women. And here's some of the big takeaways. I've got on my little board here some examples here of kind of the classic body types that you typically see. So on the left is the men. So we have the typical, triangle, which is what most men want, big shoulders, narrow waist. So we got the little triangle shape, and then we've got the apple shape. Okay, kind of, roly-poly, like we're round, we're not very muscular or whatnot. So those are really the two predominant male characteristics. And then we've got three different types of body fat partitioning for women, which is the classic pear shape. So gal's got, a little bit bigger on the bottom and then smaller on the top. We've got the more ideal in today's society hourglass shape, so we're a little bit bigger on top, we've got a narrow waist, and we're a little bit bigger on the bottom. And then we have the classic apple shape, again in sync with the men. So now most of these things we partition fat according to our hormone levels, right? So women have a lot of estrogen and progesterone floating through their system, so they generally store a lot of body fat in both their breast tissue, their glutes, and their legs, their thighs. For men have a lot of testosterone floating around in their system, so we generally develop either a lot of abdominal fat in our gut and our love handle region. That's predominantly leads us to the apple shape. Now, typically this happens when we're not exercising and our testosterone is low. Okay, if we have a good level of testosterone, we relatively stay fairly lean as long as we're doing some exercise. So pretty easy scenario for the guys. Now let's talk about the women. Totally different scenario. I mean, you've got progesterone and estrogen as the dominant female hormones. If your hormone levels are in balance, you have that classic hourglass shape for the most part. So sometimes when that system gets interrupted, sometimes you develop more of a pear shape. And this is generally in women that are very estrogen dominant, because estrogen throws a lot more body fat into storage around the hips and the thigh and the glute region. So if you have a lot of estrogen, you're going to be more pear shaped. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, you generally see both of these two characteristics throughout early stages of life, so premenopause stages. Once the hormone levels stop working for women, your estrogen and progesterone are basically no longer functioning. They're very low levels. Your testosterone is a little bit higher. You generally start turning into more of an apple type shape where your body fat starts floating into the upper realms, into the belly and the love handle region to make us this more apple shape. Okay? So now let's talk about different types of fat. You've got visceral fat, which is your deep fat that's kind of internal into your organs and whatnot. This fat is actually fairly easy to both store and remove from the body, just because it's got a good amount of beta receptor sites. It's got a lot of blood flow. Its insulin sensitivity is pretty regular. Like, it's very responsive to both insulin's anti-storage effects. So like if you have a higher level of insulin, you're going to store more. And then it's also a mix of brown and white fat. So now we'll talk about those here in a second. So visceral fat, this is our deep fat. It's easier to lose. It's also easy to store. Okay, so that's generally the first type of fat that you generally lose when you start a diet. The problem with this is you can't see the results right away, right? You have to whittle this level of fat down in order to really see results on the scale and in terms of how you look before your subcutaneous fat, this is your fat underneath the skin, comes into play. So now subcutaneous fat is generally the most targeted areas that people want to get rid of. You hear a lot of ladies like, oh, I've got the bat wing, I need to lose this fat under here, or oh, my glutes are saggy, my hips, blah, blah, blah. So those areas are underneath the skin, and they're fairly difficult to lose because the receptor sites are not very prevalent. So this is the sites that are activated by adrenaline and norepinephrine, things that cause body fat to be released into circulation. They generally don't have a great amount of blood flow. A little bit, but if you're exercising, it's better. But if you're not exercising, it's not as good. And then the insulin sensitivity is generally fairly low. Like if you have a high level of insulin, this fat just does not want to release back into circulation. So that makes insulin a key part of our process for losing fat, is controlling that insulin level. Now the type of fat, generally this is the white kind of thick, I don't even know, it's generally fairly hard and rigid fat. So this makes it equally hard to break down and turn into fuel. Granted, like if you're on a good diet and exercising well, like this fat will be taken out into circulation and used as fuel, but it's not as prevalent as your visceral fat. Now, I talked a little bit about the partitioning part of the hormone levels. So, guys with a good level of testosterone, generally they don't have a lot of fat because they generally have a fairly high metabolism and they're exercising and they're burning stuff off. If the testosterone is low, then they start packing around fat around the midsection and the love handle region. Same thing with the postmenopausal women. They've already, they've got a good amount of fat on their hips and thighs, and now the scenario changes where their hormone level is kind of more in between a woman and a guy, so their body fat starts partitioning into the upper quadrant around the abs and the love handle region. So now, as I mentioned earlier, in a premenopausal state, if your hormone levels are out of whack and you're getting a really high dose of estrogen, you're generally going to follow along with this pear shape, and you're going to store a lot of your fat in your glutes and your thigh region. So best advice, talk to a doctor, see if they can get you on some hormone regulation. And I have all of my gals, at least consider getting some hormone replacement therapy in their later years, just to kind of correct this overall level of fat partitioning effect. Because ideally, nobody wants unsightly fat on the body. Like, it's super huge. And again, you should be happy with the body you have, but remember, you can always change things up. The key is learning how to manage your nutrition and exercise appropriately so you can actually lose the fat and have the body you want. So now, typically when women start off on a fat loss plan, they're cutting their calories, they're exercising a lot. Generally, they don't see a lot of weight loss on the scale. The one reason why is because their visceral fat is being burned as long as they're doing things correctly, and they're not noticing any changes. They're not noticing any changes in their physique or on the scale. In fact, they might notice that they actually feel a little bit bigger, because if they're lifting weights, well, the muscle mass is getting bigger and that subcutaneous fat is staying relatively the same. So they have to get to a point where this visceral fat is pretty much eaten away pretty well, so that the subcutaneous fat can start getting into the mix a little bit more, and that's when you really start to see the changes. That's why it takes so long. It takes about 6 weeks to really see any noticeable changes in the body, because even though you may be losing fat, you may be losing this deep visceral fat that's not really that noticeable on the outside, when you really want, the abs to start showing, but you still have a lot of fat in your internal organs, in between your internal organs, that are being burned up, but you just don't see it. So once that visceral fat is depleted a little bit, then you start getting into that subcutaneous fat, as long as you're keeping straight with your nutrition and your exercise program. Then you start to see slowly that fat that's underneath the skin kind of whittle away. Now, women follow this pattern from the top down. First, you'll notice their face will start to lean out, the body fat underneath the skin and the chin and the jawline will start to go, and then everything flows downhill. So generally, and this is dependent on hormone levels too, but generally women will lose a lot of their breast tissue mass, because that tissue is very vascular and loses fairly quickly, but they'll also lose from their arms, their back, and their waist fairly quickly. The real troublesome area is in the hips. And the reason why this area in the hip region is so difficult to lose is because they don't have a lot of receptor sites for getting stimulated by adrenaline and all those fat burning hormones, the catecholamines, that are going to strip away that fat very easily. So that's generally the troublesome area that most women have the biggest trouble with, is that lower glute area. And all I can say is, hey, it's time, dedication, and really focusing in on your diet. And there may be some cycles where you have to go start your nutrition plan and cut really hard, and then come off of it for a week or two, and then cut back again to start that fat loss over, because that area is just really, really difficult, especially if you follow into one of these gals that has a really high estrogen component, because those are that hormone is really battling against you from losing that fat. And the reason why is because of its survival mechanism. women are kind of special in the fact that, well, they produce the babies. So everything revolves around the woman's survival instinct to be able to have a child and carry that child through labor. So lower levels of body fat generally serve as a survival mechanism to prevent a woman from starving to death if she gets a child and is going to carry it and continue to breastfeed. So those low levels of body fat allow her to be able to survive under conditions that otherwise she would not be able to survive. And so to combat that, hormone health is essential. And I'm not a great expert on female hormones, I wish I was, but the tricky thing is every woman is different and every woman has a different level. So if your hormone levels are messed up, you should probably go get them checked out and see if the doctor can prescribe you, or go to a naturopath and see if there's some healthy alternatives to either taking estrogen, progesterone compounds, or a natural form of supplementation. So, and same thing with my postmenopause gals. You know, if you guys are really struggling and you feel like your weight is just constantly increasing, well, the reason why is your hormone levels have tapped out, and you're really going to have to dial into your diet, maybe look into some hormone replacement therapy, and try to get some help in terms of weightlifting and nutrition. It's just going to be a lot longer road for you. And so all this stuff is kind of the reason why women have such a hard time losing weight. Is you have to identify, okay, what type of fat am I really burning off to start with? My visceral fat, my internal fat. That's why the results aren't looking so prominent in the mirror. And then, you know, okay, well, how long do I have to be on this to get into the subcutaneous fat? And then get into the lower levels of body fat to burn that off. So it's a very complicated scenario. Best thing is, guys, you know, hey, dedication, strength training, a little bit of cardio, and focused dieting will get you to where you want to go. But realize it's going to take a while, you know, 6 weeks to kind of tone down this visceral fat and get the body healthy enough so that it can start targeting the subcutaneous fat, and then you're on your way. So now, I mentioned a little bit about breast tissue. Breast tissue generally tends to fall off rather quickly when a woman starts a weight loss diet. So I'm sorry about this. You can't repartition it any other way. Sometimes in periods of hard dieting, if you want to go that route, a lot of women will lose their breast tissue altogether. So there's really no way around that, and it just kind of flows in with physiology. Like, you very rarely see those women that are very curvy that aren't holding a lot of body fat in other places. So you generally, you know, see either the classic pear shape or the hourglass shape. So that kind of depends on your genetics and how and your parents. So, you know, thank your parents for that one. But overall, just remember, you know, fat loss is a long process, and this is just kind of a quick overview of, like, well, there's different areas of fat, and there's different ways in which body fat is burned. You have the receptor sites, either alpha or beta. The beta receptor sites are very, you know, prominent at being able to burn fat. So they pick up on a lot of the adrenaline, and they release fatty acids in the tissue very easily. So if you have a good amount of blood flow in that area, it's going to be better off. So, you know, areas around the abdominal cavity have a lot of blood flow, so they're able to pick up body fat and use it for energy fairly quickly. And then your insulin sensitivity, if you're eating too many carbohydrates or you're stimulating your insulin level too much, a lot of these areas will just kind of shut down in terms of fat release into the bloodstream, and this is very common knowledge for most people. And then also your type of fat, your brown fat and your white fat. You know, brown fat is actually, you know, essential for, you know, creating thermogenesis and actually burning more calories at rest. So that's a good type of fat that we like to keep onto. It doesn't burn off very readily, but it's a very small percentage of overall. Our white fat is generally the tough stuff that you really have to put in the work to get it into the system and burn it off. So hopefully this little vlog post helps out with kind of delineating some of the areas and issues with losing body fat, and kind of how the process should work for both men and women. You know, that's all I have for you today, and I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little long, but, you know, hopefully you stuck with it, and I'll see you next time.